Hey everyone, thanks for checking out our Zoom recording on the session we did about trees. Unfortunately, we did not remember to hit record at the very beginning of the session, so we cut off just a little bit of information. So the session's going to start with me tapping a birch tree, and I'm talking a little bit about sap. And sap is basically just the liquid that brings the nutrients that are stored in the roots of the tree up the trunk of the tree and out the branches so that the tree can use those nutrients to make new leaves. And it's sort of a recycling process that the tree is doing. So in the fall, some of those nutrients go down to be stored into the roots because the tree is kind of going to be resting for the winter, doesn't need them. And then in the spring, when the tree is ready to make new leaves, the nutrients come up again. And that's why the sap is running in the spring, and we're going to tap into it. So thanks for checking it out. Stick around, and we will get to tapping.
So first things first, we're gonna have to drill into the tree to get to that sapwood. Because remember I said we gotta go through a couple of layers. So we'll go through the bark, the cambium, the phloem, and then we'll get into that sapwood where the sap is flowing. Now, this is the time of year to tap a birch tree. Earlier in the year, about a month ago, I tapped the maple trees. You might be more familiar with collecting maple sap, making maple syrup. That's what a lot of people do. And maple syrup is maybe a bit tastier than birch syrup. Kids like it a little bit better. But now is the time of year to tap the birches. So that's why we're going to give this a go today. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about maples. So let us see here. What we want to do is make it on a slight angle, just a little bit, so that gravity can pull the sap out for us. We also don't necessarily want to put it right underneath wherever there's a branch coming out. There's going to be a bit of a knot in the tree. We don't want to do that. And it'd be nice if we could get somewhere that gets a little bit of sunlight. Birch trees like a lot of sun, so chances are wherever your birch tree is, there's a lot of sunlight. So we can kind of go anywhere along this tree. And the last thing to consider, once we know that it's a birch tree and it's in a good spot and we're not going under any of the branches, you just want to make sure your tree is actually big enough. So if you think you want to try tapping next year and you want to go out and get some of these taps from Home Hardware and give it a try, you just want to make sure that your tree is big enough. Because if you take it, put a hole in a tree that's too small, the hole might be too big for that tree. It might actually hurt the tree. Tree that's nice and big like this one's not really going to notice a little hole in it. So that's all right. All right, so what we're going to do here, I think I like this spot right here because it's not too close to anywhere where branches used to be. Nice and flat. And I have a drill bit that's a ½ an inch because that's about the size of my tap. So I'm going to want to tap in there. So let's give it a go. All right. So we're starting to get a little bit of sawdust in there. We don't want that in the way. And already a little bit of sap is actually coming out here. So a little bit of water is dripping down there, or what looks like water. That's the sap, so that's good. That means it's flowing. That means our tree's getting ready to make some leaves. Now I might need to go a little deeper because my taps are pretty long. That's right. Don't try this at home unless you have a grown up with a power drill. It's a big project. You got to do some planning also. Let's see if we're deep enough yet. Almost, almost. So you want your tap to go in and sort of be nice and snug in there because you need water to get sort of pushed out of here. And so this needs to be a nice tight seal around there, or else all your sap's just going to drip right down your tree. You're going to lose it. And that is no good. There we go. That's nice and tight. So then you're just going to tap it in a little bit. You can see how the sap is starting to come out of our tap. So that means we got it in a good spot. I'm just going to give it a little tap. Don't want to hit it too hard. If you can see, this tap here snapped right off because I hit it too hard one time. So you don't want to do that. And now the sap is flowing. I want to catch it. So I'm going to put a little bucket here. This hangs underneath. And now the sap's going to drip, drip, drip into there, and I'll be able to collect it. And so I'll probably collect it every day or every other day. I'll come out and get some sap. So now we can head back to our picnic table, and I'll show you what to do with the sap once you got it. All right, Jillian, have we got any questions so far about trees and tapping and sap?
Not yet. If anyone does have any questions, you can type it in the chat, and then I'll let Madison know your question and she can answer it for you.
Awesome. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so that's good how easy it is to tap trees. So if that's something you want to give a try to next year, it's pretty fun. You might have some of those trees in your backyard. You can tap maples of any kind and birches of any kind. Now, once you have collected all your sap, you're going to go out with your bucket. And this is sap that I've been collecting over the past couple days from my maples, like I mentioned. So I first tapped the maples on the 17th of March. So they've been going for about a month now, I guess, yeah. And over that time, I've filled this bucket up several times. This is 10 liters of sap. So here, I'll pour it out so you can see what it looks like. There, so just like the sap that was coming out of our birch tree there, it looks a lot like water. There's not a whole lot going on there. You can't really tell it's anything special. It doesn't have a very strong flavor. The sap is almost entirely water. You might notice that there's a couple of things floating around in there. Some bits of other trees that seem to have blown in. It looks a little bit dirty. So the first thing usually I'll do is I'll filter it out, and then I'll pour it in my big pot here. So this big pot here can hold about as much as this bucket. And again, that's about 10 liters. So you pour this bucket in here and you put this on the stove, and you'll have to cook this for most of the day, like probably about 5 hours. And over time, the water that's in the sap will start to evaporate. Because remember I said what we're looking for here is sugar, and there's only a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of sugar in here. It's almost entirely water. So what you need to do is get the water hot, so that it turns into steam, it evaporates, it goes away, and it just leaves the sugar and the nutrients and the tasty stuff behind. So over time, it will slowly start to change color as it loses water. It will slowly get a little bit darker, maybe a little bit cloudier. It will start to change its smell a little bit. It will actually start to smell a little bit like the syrup. It'll start to get a little bit sweeter. And finally, so this is what, it's all pretty watery still. It's pretty liquidy still. And this is what's going on inside this pot for about 5 hours. And then finally, it will start to get down really, really low. And I'll switch it over to this pot. And in this pot, it will start to get really, really hot because almost all the water's gone now. And it will start to turn into syrup. So you can see now it gets a little bit thicker because the sugar is starting to crystallize, starting to turn into something nice and thick, like what you pour on your pancakes. And this is the stage you finally get it to when you want to eat it. So right here, you could still eat it if you wanted to. You could drink it. Some people like to drink maple sap or birch sap because it's good for you. But this stuff doesn't last for very long. If you want it to last all through the summer and the fall, then you got to get it nice and syrupy like that. So that's the process you got to follow. Now with the birch sap, it's a little bit different. So maybe you've never heard of birch syrup before. Lots of people haven't. It's not very common. And that's because making birch syrup is a really long process. So when I collect my maple sap and I fill one of these buckets up, one of these buckets, after all of the boiling and all of the sitting in the buckets or sitting on the stove in the pots, it will finally turn into this after about 8 hours. So maybe in a week of collecting sap and boiling it down, I'll have that much syrup. So that's a lot of sap. It's a lot of time just to make a little bit of syrup. But with birch, if you were to get a bucket of this sap and you wanted to turn it into syrup, you would get not even enough syrup to fill that jar because there's so much water in the birch sap. It takes so long to actually get it down into syrup. And this is why people don't make it very often. They don't eat it very often. That's probably why you've never heard of it before. Another thing about the birch is that birch trees have a different kind of sugar in them than maple trees. So you might have tried maple syrup before and you think it's really tasty. I think it's really tasty. But the syrup or the sugar that's inside birch has a really different flavor. So it tastes a little bit fruitier. It tastes a little bit more like molasses, and you actually can't get it very hot while you're evaporating all that water. So when I put my maple in here, I turn it on to a boil, and all sorts of steam comes off, and it happens really fast, and I can do it in about 5 hours. But when you try to turn birch into syrup, it takes more like 10 or 11 hours because you have to do it really slowly. So that maybe is why you've never heard of it before. But we're going to give it a try here anyway, as we've already tapped our birches, and I'll let you know in a couple weeks how it turns out if we can manage to get a little bit of birch syrup there. Does anyone have any questions so far about sap and trees?
Yeah, we've got some questions. So
Okay.
Sarah and Maddie were asking, where can we purchase a tree tapping kit?
Yes, so I just got my taps at the Home Hardware here in CBS. You can buy them as a pack. I think I got 10 in a pack. They were only about 20 bucks. And then buckets, I just got them at Dollarama for $2 each. So it's pretty easy. And then all you really need other than that is some big pots. So you're gonna want a pot that's like pretty big so you can get all that sap boiled down. And then when you're finally ready to make the syrup, you're gonna want some sort of thermometer. So make sure you can get your syrup to 218 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's just important if you want your syrup to last a long time. If you were just gonna make it and then eat it right away, then you wouldn't really have to worry about the temperature that it gets to. So yeah, you guys can definitely give that a try next year if you want.
Okay, and the Best family is asking, how long does it take to fill that silver bucket with sap when you hang it on the tree?
That's a very good question. So it really depends on a couple of different things. So in order for the sap to flow really well, especially with the maples, you need the temperature to be cold at night and warm during the day. So that sort of causes the tree to get bigger and smaller as the water freezes and thaws. And so that sort of pumps the sap up and allows the sap to come out really fast. So when we have good nights of like, you know, -3, and then it gets up to 4 degrees during the day and a bit of sun shines down on the trees, then you get a really, really fast drip coming out of your trees. And one of those buckets, like we hung up today, could be full after about 2 days. Now then you'll have a couple of days where it doesn't go below 0 at night, or it doesn't go above 0 during the day, and your trees will stop dripping again. So it really kind of just depends. And some trees are just better than others at producing. So some trees are a little bit bigger, they have a bigger canopy, so they're sort of pumping more sap up to make more leaves. And those trees are going to give you a lot more sap. So this is my second year tapping the trees here at Manuels, and I have a couple of trees that are like good sap producers. I always know that the bucket is going to be pretty full. And then I've got some that are, you know, not so great. So I didn't tap them this year. I tried some other ones. Some of them are all right. It kind of just depends on what the tree is trying to do. But we're really fortunate here in Newfoundland that we have such a long spring, and it goes below 0 and above 0 for so many weeks at a time. So you really can be collecting from your trees for many weeks at a time. In most other parts of Canada, you can only do it for maybe 2 weeks, and then it gets too warm during the evenings and you can't do it anymore. And here my maple trees have been going for a whole month. So it is a good spot to get into some backyard tapping. We have the right climate for it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just a couple more from Chloe and McKenna.
Okay.
They were wondering, what season do you tap, and how do you know the tree is ready to be tapped?
Good question. So the number one thing you want to look for on the maple trees, I mean, you want to look at the weather, because the weather is really important. You want to make sure that it's going above 0 during the day and below 0 at night. But the maple trees are pretty much ready to start going as soon as it starts to warm up during the day. But you can tell by looking for buds on the trees. So you can see maybe a little bit of the buds there. Those are the little baby leaves that are about to grow. And remember, the sap is taking all the nutrients from the roots out the branches so that it can grow new leaves. So if your tree is starting to make buds, that means it's starting to make new leaves. It needs those nutrients from the roots. So once you see that the buds are starting on your trees, then it's a good time to go. And once your trees actually grow the leaves and these buds open up into new leaves, that's when you want to stop tapping, because after that your sap's going to start taking on kind of a weird kind of grassy flavor. So really it's that kind of sweet spot in between when the buds arrive and when the leaves arrive. That's when it's the right time for tapping. But generally spring is the time you do it, and you start your maples first because they're going to have their buds out first, and then you start your birches about a month later.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. There is one more question though. McKenna was also wondering how tree roots grow.
How tree roots grow? Oh, okay. So they have a different process. So they have if you were to take a tree and you were to look at it really, really closely, if you were to take a microscope and look at it really up close, it has a special edge all along the outside of the root where there are things called cells. And cells are like the building blocks of everything that's alive. And those cells all along the edge there are the ones that are growing. So they make more cells and more cells and more cells, and they slowly shoot their way out. So they've got a different thing going on. They don't have to worry about making leaves and then recycling them over and over again. They're just growing themselves longer and longer and longer. It's a little bit like how the end of the tree twig kind of shoots out and grows a little bit longer every year. They just sort of slowly elongate by dividing their cells into two. So that's all our questions about trees so far?
Yep, that's everything. So
Perfect.
we've got about 9 minutes left.
Perfect, just time for us to do our experiment. So we talked a little bit about the parts of the tree when we were talking about drilling into it. And I mentioned that there was a little section called the phloem, and then we got into something called the sapwood, which is where all the sap was dripping from. And on other plants that are not trees, that don't have wood, we call that part the xylem. And today we're going to look at the xylem by looking at some celery. So hopefully some of you guys got some celery at home. And it's a little bit hard to see when you first snip it off, but if you've got a pair of scissors, you can snip off a little piece of celery and you can look along the bottom, and there are sort of little holes all along the bottom there. And those are the ends of little tubes. And those little tubes are the xylem and the phloem, and they're carrying the nutrients from the bottom of the celery, from the roots which are growing here, up and out to the leaves of the celery. Now that's not very exciting looking when you just look at the celery, but what you can do is you can actually see what the xylem itself is doing by putting together a little experiment. And it takes about a day, maybe overnight, for it to start working. But to set it up, what you're going to want to do is take a little piece of celery from the middle of your stalk so that it still has some leaves on it. So one of these skinny little ones in the middle. And you're just going to snip it off. Now, if you don't have scissors and you just want to snap it off, that's okay. But maybe get an adult to sort of shave the bottom of it off for you so it's nice and flat on the bottom. That'll make it easier to see. So you got your piece of celery here, leaves at the top. You're going to stick it in a jar. Going to pour a bit of water into it. I'm going to knock things over here. Oh, Lord. And now you want to add a good amount of food coloring to that. And you're going to want to pick some colors that are not, say, green or yellow. So maybe like, I'm going to try making some orange here, I think. So I'm going to put in a bunch of red, put in a bunch of yellow. You want a nice, deep, dark color. So just kind of go to town with putting your food coloring in there. Make sure it's good, strong. Yeah, like 10 drops at least. All right, so then you're gonna sit this aside somewhere where it's not gonna get knocked over. And you're gonna wanna leave it for, I would say check on it tomorrow morning for best results. And what we're gonna see is that the celery, those little tubes that run up and down the celery, the xylem and the phloem, now we can kind of see they've been dyed. They're carrying all of this water and this dye all the way up the celery, up the stalk, and out into the leaves. And so the leaves used to be this nice green color, and they've turned sort of this purpley red color because this colored water got carried up and out. And that's the same process that happens in the tree. So the sapwood, or the xylem of the tree, carries the water from the roots down in the bottom, up the inside of the tree and out toward the leaves. So that's a little experiment you guys can try at home. but it takes a little while to get it to work. And you just want to make sure that it'll work even if you just snap your celery off and it's kind of trailing at the bottom. But if you really want to be able to see the holes of the xylem, then you just want to make sure you give it a good sniff at the bottom. So if you need a grown-up to help you with knives and that sort of thing, then make sure it's nice and flat at the bottom. So that is a little bit about how the tree, oh, I see it at the top too. You can see the xylem and the phloem at the top too. Kind of cool. And technically the xylem is the part that brings the nutrients from the bottom up to the top, and the phloem actually takes nutrients from the leaves down into the roots. Because some of you probably know that leaves are pretty important for making the tree's food. That's why they've got chlorophyll in them. They soak up all of the sun and they make energy and food. And so that means that when the roots want to grow and they need energy, then something needs to be able to transport all of those good nutrients from the leaves down the stalk and out into the roots. So it's two ways of transportation, xylem going up and phloem going down. But we can't really tell the difference between the xylem and the phloem by looking at them here. We would need to do a little more digging. We would need like a proper microscope to really see the difference there. Do you have any questions about xylem or phloem or celery?
We did have one more tree question.
One more tree question.
Allison,
Shoot.
yep. Allison is wondering, how many layers does a tree have?
How many layers does a tree have?
And
Oh,
you got
okay,
about
so
4 minutes.
okay, so there's the bark, and the bark is technically got two layers, an inner bark and an outer bark that you can sometimes see depending on the tree. Then the cambium is underneath the bark, and the cambium is where the xylem and the phloem are created. So the cambium sort of makes new xylem and phloem and makes new cells that migrate into the phloem and the xylem or the sapwood. And then inside the tree, there will be the heartwood, which is underneath the sapwood, so closer to the middle. And then the very, very center of the tree will be something called the pith. So there's not a whole lot going on biologically. There's not a whole lot of living going on in the center of the tree in the pith. All of the sort of active things that the tree is doing is in the outer parts. So the bark has to grow to replace any damage that happens to the tree. It's kind of like the tree's skin. It has to sort of close up any holes. The cambium is doing lots of growing because it's making new xylem and new phloem. And the xylem and the phloem are doing lots of stuff because they're moving things around all the time. So those are the really, really busy parts of the tree. And in the inside of the tree, there's not a whole lot going on. Just structure, just making sure the tree stays nice and strong, maybe flows in the wind a little bit, doesn't snap. All right, so do we have any other questions about trees?
No, that's all the questions.
Okay, and are we just about out of time?
Yeah, we've got 2 minutes left.
Okay, cool. So give your celery experiment a try. If you want to send me a picture to show me how it turned out, that would be great. I'd love to see it. Maybe come up with some different colors, some purple or some blue, and we'll see how lovely celery looks when it gets dyed purple and blue. And yeah, I'll let you guys know in a couple of weeks how well my birch syrup turned out, because hopefully I'll have enough birch sap by then to fill this little jar with syrup, and we'll see if it's tasty. Next week, we're going to learn about fossils. So keep your eye out for our YouTube video and an email to let you know what you need to learn about fossils. And yeah, just email me at discovery@manuelsriver.ca if you have any questions or if you want to share any pictures. Thanks for coming. See ya.
Got one more question if we can get to it in the 1 minute we have left.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Luke asked, do trees have protection from bugs?
Oh yeah, they definitely do. I think a good example of that would be our evergreen trees, because they produce all sorts of things. So you know how like the smell of a tree, like a Christmas tree, is really, really strong? That's because it's full of things called terpenes. And terpenes are these really stinky chemicals, and lots of creatures really don't like terpenes. They stay away from them. So that keeps bugs and really all sorts of critters from munching away on trees that have those inside them. So lots of trees have these sort of chemical weapons that they build to try and stop herbivores from coming along and eating them, or insects from coming along maybe and drilling inside the tree and making a home there. A lot of that is chemicals that we don't necessarily see, but you might smell them, or you might maybe get something sticky on your hands when you're touching a tree because it's got some resin or something like that in it. That's a good way that the tree can protect itself too. That's a good question.